So the traffic pattern. The student should develop knowledge of the elements related to the proper procedures, rules, and elements of the traffic pattern at both the controlled and uncontrolled field. The student will be able to demonstrate this knowledge as required in the ACS or PTS. The main points from this one, we're going to talk about how to get into the pattern, our communication, and orientation. Now, so those are the big three. The main elements we're going to talk about are the pattern, controlled versus uncontrolled, orientation to the runway, maintaining proper spacing, wind shear, and wake turbulence. Now, the pattern is something you're going to have to see basically every time you depart and every time you land. It's always going to be part of your flight, essentially. And it's standardized so that everybody knows what they're doing and we all do the same thing the same way. It's basically a race track shape around the runway. And most of the time, the standard turns are to the left. So left turns. If you ever see RP on a chart or a chart supplement, that means right pattern, and we're making right turns. But for today, we're just going to focus on left pattern. The main the legs of the traffic pattern are the departure leg, crosswind, downwind, base, and final. Okay. Obviously, we depart on the departure end. We're going to be departing into the wind, and we're going to be landing into the wind because that's going to reduce our ground speed. At 700 feet above the surface, when we climb out, we're going to make our turn to crosswind. So 700 feet above the surface. When we're 1,000 feet, we're going to continue climbing in crosswind. When we're 1,000 feet, we're going to turn to downwind. So 700 feet, turn to crosswind. 1,000 feet, turn downwind. Right? That's the standard. Now, on the downwind, you don't want to be in full afterburner in your Cessna 172 on the downwind. You want to be at a comfortable speed, something like 90 knots. That's really the best, I found the best speed to be at on downwind. But there's no legal requirement. In the 172, we have specific speeds we're going to use, and we're going to talk about those later. So on the downwind, once you're abeam the numbers, this is when you're going to start running through your landing sequence. We're going to descend from this point again to 700 feet, and then we're going to turn base. So 700 feet crosswind, 700 feet base, and then the downwind is 1,000. And then we're going to turn final and coming in for a landing. Now, that's great if you are starting off on the runway, but what happens if you're coming from a different runway or different airfield? Well, you're going to enter, the standard entry is this 45-degree angle to the downwind leg. So 45 degrees here. And we call that the 45. So on the radios, we'll be like, Payne Tower or Jefferson traffic Cessna 3 that goes on the 45 for runway 27. Okay. Now, controlled versus uncontrolled or towered versus non-towered fields. At a towered airfield, you're going to be in contact with the tower, obviously, and they're going to tell you how to get into the field. So something like 10 miles out, we're going to call them up and say, Payne Tower, Cessna 243 at Echo, to land with information Bravo. And that's just the weather. We'll deal with that later. So 10 miles out, you're going to let them know, hey, I'm coming in. I would like to land. And they'll say something like, Roger, enter on the 45 for left downwind, runway 34. There, bam. Right? And so you will repeat back. Remember, always repeat back your clearances. Enter on the left downwind, or on the 45 for left downwind for runway 34, Cessna 3 Echo. And you'll enter on the left downwind and then make standard patterns. Remember, 700 feet. Once we are at 700 feet, we're going to turn base and then final. That's great. Tower tells us what to do. Love it. They might tell you enter on the base, or they might tell you enter straight in or enter on the downwind, whatever. They're going to tell you how to do it. And it's super easy. You just follow their instructions and do the right thing. Now, what happens if you're at an uncontrolled airfield? Well, same thing. 10 miles out, we're going to self-announce. Jefferson traffic, Cessna 3 at Echo is 10 miles out to land for runway 27. And then you're going to enter on that 45. And you're going to keep making radio calls as you do it. Excuse me. So on the 45, we'll say Jefferson traffic, Cessna 3 Echoes on the 45 for left downwind, runway 27. And then on base, or when we're on final, Jefferson traffic, Cessna 38 Echo is on left downwind, runway 27, Jefferson traffic. And we always sandwich our radio calls with the airfield at non-controlled or non-towered fields. Turning base, Jefferson traffic, Cessna 38 Echo, turning left base, runway 27. And then final, don't say left final, you'll get made fun of. Jefferson traffic, Cessna 38 Echo is on final, runway 27. Right? So that covers it, right? I think. So maintaining proper spacing. Now, we want to give ourselves enough space. About a mile is a good space here between you and the runway. Honestly, the way I remember this, if we're looking at the runway here, I'm looking at my strut. This is my wing. I'm looking out like off my left wing. I want the runway off my left strut at 1,000 feet above the field. And you're going to learn this in your specific aircraft. But basically, find visual reference points in your plane that will help you maintain good spacing. But that's the one for me, halfway up the strut at 1,000 feet. Now, there might be other aircraft in the pattern as well, and you want to be aware of that. You don't want to get too close to another airplane because you might trade paint and have a rough day. So if you hear another aircraft in the pattern, maybe do a 360 before entering on the 45. The tower might actually have you do a right 360 in the pattern for spacing. Actually, it would be the second guy. Basically, they might say something like, hey, make a right 360 for spacing, report when you're back on downwind. And all you're going to do is make a right turn for a minute and come back onto downwind. Now, let's see. About here, you want to be at least a quarter of a mile, maybe half mile out. This 45-degree angle is a good reference point as well. Yeah, cool. Now let's talk about wind shear and wake turbulence. First of all, what is wind shear? Wind shear is a sudden change of direction and velocity of the wind. It's not fun. And sometimes you can experience this in a strong downdraft. If you experience a downdraft like this, you'll first experience a very intense headwind. Your performance will increase. And then as you penetrate the downdraft, it'll shear to a vertical or tailwind. And your performance is going to drop. And you're going to get pulled up and then all of a sudden drop down like this. Not fun. The way we avoid the best thing to do is avoid them. But the way we avoid them is by getting a good weather brief and not flying when we have hazardous weather. You really want to avoid this, right? Now, wake turbulence is something that you're going to have to be aware of. Wake turbulence is generated by an aircraft when it is generating lift. So when the aircraft is departing, you're going to see, wake turbulence generating. And then when it lands, it should end once the aircraft has got all three landing gear on the ground. All right. We always want to avoid flying in another aircraft's wake turbulence. If you're flying behind a heavy aircraft, give it like 3 minutes before you depart, before you land, just to let it dissipate. If you have to land immediately after another heavy aircraft, try to land beyond their touchdown point or try to take off before their departure point. But remember, you're not going to outclimb a Cessna, a 747. You're in a Cessna 172. So be mindful of the aircraft wake turbulence. Really, the best thing to do is give it time. So some common errors with the traffic pattern is poor altitude and or poor airspeed, or inability to maintain proper altitude or airspeed. So when you are flying the pattern, nail that 1,000 feet. Nail your airspeed, 95 knots, 85 knots, whatever it is. Improper correction for wind drift. As we are flying, we'll have our nose pointed parallel with the runway. But if there is a crosswind, it's going to blow us off course. Our airplane's basically in a giant air ocean. And so any wind is going to blow us off course. So we might have to crab into the wind like this. So our airplane will fly this way, the wind will blow us this way, and our path will be what we want. So proper correction for wind drift. Nail that. Inadequate spacing, making sure you're using your visual reference points to keep yourself spaced correctly with the runway and other aircraft, and then failure to comply with ATC regulations or common procedures. So study your radio call, study the airport you're going to, and do the right thing. Man.